I've been thinking about the remembrances that we've been exploring. We spent a month exploring the idea that we are of the nature to age, that we can't escape aging. And now this month, we're exploring that we are of the nature to become sick. We can't escape that either. When I initially heard these remembrances, some level of fear and resistance arose. No, no, I don't want to get old. I don't want to get sick. So I wonder why the Buddha teaches us to reflect on these. And I think it's because if we resist the truth of this life or we misunderstand it, we actually miss something of life, its fullness and its beauty, even in the uncomfortable times. Whether it's a cold or the flu from which we will recover, hopefully, or something more chronic that we have to learn to live with, we each will be faced with the vulnerability of being sick. And if the inevitability of that isn't clear to us, we might imagine that we've done something wrong. We didn't eat the right thing, or we ate too much of the wrong thing. We let ourselves get run down. We didn't exercise enough. We think we could have done something different and that we are at fault in some way for getting sick. So this remembrance reminds us that we didn't do anything wrong, that it is the nature of our bodies to get sick. It's unavoidable. And so instead of denying it or blaming ourselves, the remembrance is encouraging us to find a different way to be with illness when it arises. And the Dharma, more broadly, helps teach us how to hold sickness, just like we learn how to hold other things that are unwanted and uncomfortable. So, can we just reorient a little bit and make some space for this? What would it be to sink in just a little bit to the vulnerability that arises when we accept that we are of the nature to get sick? It's not easy, and I don't in any way want to minimize the challenges of illness. But I do think maybe there's a different way to be in these moments. When we're sick, we can see and feel a little more clearly our innate frailty and vulnerability. It's there all the time, but it's not quite as apparent when we're not feeling well and can't do all that we'd like. And the thing is, we're not alone with this. Every one of us share this. If we're living in these bodies, we are all of the nature to be sick. So this might be a place of connection between us if we let it. I think it's kind of paradoxical because when we're sick, we tend to isolate. The discomfort that we feel pulls us a little more inwardly and becomes a focus of our attention. And our need to slow down takes us out of the mainstream of our lives. It disconnects us from the pace of the world around us so that it can feel like we're very alone and quite separate. And yet, this is also a place of connection because we've all been there. We all know the feeling of not being able to live our lives fully in good health. And compassion arises, right? We feel compassion for someone who's sick because we get it from our own experience. And that compassion, I think, motivates us frequently. I bet that many of us are caregivers here, either by nature or professionally. We've cared for parents and partners and friends. And we know it's hard work. But being able to care for another in these times, it feels good in some way, doesn't it? It's connecting in some way, one to another. So I think that's true. And on the flip side, when we are the one in need of care, receiving is a lot harder for us to do. Receiving care can make us feel a little weak, maybe unworthy or beholden to someone. I remember that there was a question in the Q&A about this just a couple weeks ago, and the person expressed just those kinds of feelings. And I think this kind of attitude towards receiving care runs particularly deep in us here in the US. We have this national ethos of independence. And I sometimes think that it's epitomized in the iconic cowboy who is self-sufficient and strong no matter what. And this kind of misguided messaging makes it hard to receive the gift of care when we may need it. I don't want to be pie in the sky about this. But when we're sick, we do have this chance to learn about receiving. And I see this happening in two ways. It's the way we're able to receive care from ourselves when we accept that we're ill. And it's also the kindness from others when we can't quite care for ourselves. Think about how we can receive our own kindness. How many of us ignore the symptoms of being sick and try to push through our busy lives as if we're well? I know I do this sometimes. I kind of ignore my body. I ignore what I probably need. It's so hard to let go of all the doing that our lives entail and to sink into what our bodies are trying to tell us. This past winter, I had pneumonia, and it was weeks of carrying on despite the symptoms before I actually gave in to slowing down, because I didn't have the strength at that point to do otherwise. And I remember clearly the feeling of caring for myself, having compassion for myself, and how my body responded by letting go and relaxing even within the discomfort. It's still palpable in the memory of that time. So this is one aspect of receiving. Not pushing away or disconnecting from any part of ourselves and receiving the kindness we can offer. But maybe more challenging for us is learning to accept and receive help from others when we're sick. Just think for a moment of how that is for you. And I want to tell you a small anecdote when I really learned this. A few years ago, soon after we had moved to Vermont, my husband fell on the ice and had a pretty severe knee injury. It required surgery and then 3 months of being in a brace with no weight bearing on that leg. So he was basically sequestered to the couch. And the tasks that normally we did together to keep the house going were mostly left up to me. And because it was in winter, there were many more of them. It was walking the dog, bringing in the wood, keeping the fire stoked, shoveling the walkways, raking the roof, then shopping, cooking, cleaning, and assisting my husband with activities that he couldn't do. I have a lot of stories from that time, but just to say, I fell into bed each night exhausted. And truthfully, it was unsustainable, but I wasn't ready to admit that. I just kind of kept on. But within days, without our asking, our friends organized a meal train. And they brought delicious food every other day to the house. And one neighbor came over after each snow to shovel and rake the roof. Another walked the dog. A friend drove Dan to doctor's appointments. Some even came by just to visit, which was so great. And we could feel people wanted to help us. We were blown away. We felt so held and cared for. And not to say that those thoughts of unworthiness didn't arise now and again in moments. But basically, we had to receive because we wouldn't have been able to do it on our own. And we made it through. And in the late spring, when Dan was able to walk again, we had a small party to thank everyone, and there were over 30 people there. So that adage that it takes a village, I can really attest that it's true. The experience really changed both of us. In facing our vulnerability and welcoming the help that was offered, we really deepened our connection and friendships in the community. And what could have been a really isolating experience actually ended up being really life-affirming. Since then, Dan has taken on his own small practice, kind of in response to this experience. Whenever he makes soup, he always makes a few extra quarts. And now, whenever we hear of someone that's not well, we deliver a quart of soup. So that, in a really small way, is what came out of this experience for us. We cannot do this life alone. And that becomes so apparent when we're sick. And this remembrance helps us to lean away from our isolation and individualism and into our connection, to acknowledge our interdependence, our common humanity. And if we're lucky, our bouts of sickness come and go. And so we can, over time, be both the caregiver and the receiver. You know, we generally say these remembrances in the first person. I am of the nature to be sick. There's no escaping being sick. But we can just as well say we are of the nature to be sick. It's something we share in life. So try this when you're in a crowd of people or when you're thinking of a friend. You might whisper to yourself, we are of the nature to be sick. You are of the nature to be sick, just like me. we share this, and it can in some way connect us. So thank you for listening. And let's transition to our time of practice. And as we always do, we bring attention first to these bodies. And we notice what they need. Just as I spoke about, when we're sick, we notice what we need. And in this moment too, if there are stretches that would feel good, or a need to energize our bodies before we sit, not missing the less obvious places, maybe the jaws, the eyes. Taking all the time you need before you bring yourself into a posture of relative stillness. Letting yourself settle into your seat. Feeling the weightiness of your body. As your buttock settles into the chair or the cushion. And maybe with a deeper than normal breath, as if you're taking a big sigh. And on that out breath, letting your shoulders down, your tummy loosen. Just relaxing into this moment. And with some intention of welcoming, warmly welcoming whatever arises, bringing your attention inside. With enough energy for focus to stay with your experience. And at the same time, enough relaxation to provide spaciousness. Notice how when the body becomes more relaxed, the mind too begins to relax. And although it might drift off, now and again we invite it back to rest on body sensations, on what's happening right now. Keeping it really simple. Just this. And now just this. Thank you all.